The entire class erupted in disgusted shrieks and horrified gasps as the Komodo dragon on the screen ripped chunks of bloody flesh off the flailing water buffalo's carcass, its intestines spilling out in gruesome wet coils onto the dusty ground. Edward grinned. The students stared in slack-jawed disbelief, unable to reconcile the graphic primal savagery they had just witnessed with their pristine image of harmonious ecosystems. Shock, revulsion, and a twinge of fearful awe flickered across their alien faces. Edward's grin widened. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is just another typical Tuesday on planet Earth. Edward Warren, the sole human student in Xenobiology 101, had just finished presenting an array of disturbing videos showcasing Earth's vicious predators and the daily brutal struggle for survival that defined his homeworld's biosphere. Professor Vortis, the class's stern Riemann instructor, had initially accused Edward of fabricating tall tales when the human casually mentioned that some Earth plants ate animals. The videos were Edward's way of proving his claims about Earth's deadly flora and fauna. Mission accomplished, and then some. His classmates looked positively green around the gills, or whatever passed for gills on their respective species. It had started as a simple introduction exercise. Each student shared a unique fact about their native ecosystem. The Aquilans boasted about their planet's floating cloud cities. The Zephyrians described oceans that glowed purple with bioluminescent algae, all very quaint and picturesque. Then, Edward's turn came. The humans' descriptions of carnivorous pitcher plants and venomous vipers had drawn skeptical laughs. Parasitic worms burrowing into eyeballs elicited disgusted groans. But seeing the raw footage of cheetahs tearing apart gazelles and crocodiles, suddenly lunging from murky water to crush zebras in their toothy maws, that stunned the class into horrified silence. These apex predators weren't the product of some dystopian holonovel. They were real. They roamed Earth in the millions. And a helpless human like Edward had grown up surrounded by them. As the shock wore off, his classmates pelted Edward with morbidly curious questions. Did all humans carry weapons to defend against those beasts? How many people got eaten each year? What was that red stuff oozing out of the buffalo blood? They had never seen blood before since their species leaked clear ichor when injured. The very concept of hemoglobin fascinated and appalled them. Edward patiently answered their queries, secretly pleased at how this sudden notoriety elevated him from a meek alien minority to a hardened survivor of a deadly world. Even Professor Vortis treated him with wary respect now, admitting Earth was far more hardcore than the Raymond had assumed. Word of Earth's chilling nature soon spread through the academy grapevine. Whispers followed Edward in the halls. Students gawked as if they expected him to pounce and maul someone at any second. A few even begged him to share more of his freaky nature vids from back home. An idea dawned on Edward. He could spin this macabre interest in Earth's wildlife into a lucrative side hustle. He started charging classmates to view exclusive access clips, even scoring an interview on the campus holocast to discuss his death planet. For once, being the weird, hairless ape in a school of exotic aliens felt like an advantage. But not everyone bought into the humans are badass survivors hype. Professor Zekton, Vortis's academic rival, smelled an opportunity. Humanity's membership in the Federation was already controversial. If Zekton could paint this impressionable youth's profiteering as proof that humans were too violent and greedy to join civilized galactic society, well, young Ed was about to learn that two could play the manipulation game, and Zekton played for keeps. Edward's heart raced as the automated message flashed across his holopad. Report to Dean Zorgax's office immediately. This couldn't be good. The door to Zorgax's office hissed open, revealing the stern Raymond hunched over his ornate titanium desk. The dean's beady eyes narrowed as Edward entered. Sit, Zorgax grunted, gesturing to the angular chrome chair across from him. Edward lowered himself into the seat, the cold metal biting into his skin. He forced a nonchalant grin. What's this about, Dean Z? Zorgax's nostrils flared. Your little horror show is causing quite a stir on campus. Students are complaining. Faculty are concerned. Edward leaned back, folding his arms behind his head. I'm just giving them a dose of reality, Dean. Not my fault they can't handle the truth about life on Earth. The dean glowered, his ridged brow furrowing. Mr. Warren, need I remind you that you are a guest on Rima Prime? Your graphic displays of violence are highly disruptive to the learning environment we strive to maintain. Oh, like the Riemann Empire hasn't conquered half the galaxy at gunpoint. Zorgax bristled, his scales rippling. Choose your next words very carefully, human. Edward met the dean's glare unflinchingly. I'm not going to sugarcoat things just because it makes people uncomfortable. You can't censor the truth. The Riemann's heart made, a vein pulsing in his leathery temple. He jabbed a clawed finger at Edward. You are on thin ice, Mr. Warren. If I hear one more complaint about your antics, there will be severe consequences. Am I clear? Edward shrugged. Crystal. Zorgax waved dismissively toward the door. You may go, but heed my warning. Tread carefully. Edward sauntered out, a defiant smirk playing at his lips. Zorgax wanted him to play nice? Fat chance. It was time to double down. The lecture hall buzzed with anticipation as scores of students filed in, their eyes wide with morbid curiosity. Edward stood at the podium, fiddling with the projector controls. Showtime. Welcome to my first ever live stream Q&A, Edward declared, flashing a winning smile at the camera drone hovering nearby. Tonight, we're going to dive deep into the deadly wonders of planet Earth. So buckle up and keep a barf bag handy. The crowd giggled nervously, exchanging apprehensive glances. Edward launched into his carefully curated highlight reel of Earth's most lethal predators. The brutal efficiency of great white shark attacks, the paralyzing neurotoxins of black mamba bites, the bone-crushing power of grizzly bear jaws. But what really got their attention was the reverent way Edward described his fellow humans' ability to survive and thrive amid such unrelenting peril. He spoke of Maasai warriors facing down lions with nothing but spears, of Arctic hunters braving sub-zero temperatures and polar bears, of Amazon tribes coexisting with venomous snakes and piranhas. As he flipped through images of tribesmen posing proudly with their kills, the audience gasped in amazement. A tentative appendage raised from the sea of astounded faces. Yes, in the back, Edward pointed. Question. A willowy Floraxian trembled as she stood. How do humans not live in constant fear surrounded by such nightmarish creatures? She squeaked. Edward grinned. Bold of you to assume we don't. A wave of uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd. But seriously, we humans clawed our way to top of the food chain through sheer grit, wits, and a hell of a lot of pointy sticks. We're the apex predators now. Xyloth, the spindly Aquilin president of the Xenobiology Club, lingered by the stage steps after the event, his head tentacles undulating with excitement. Ed, my man, killer presentation, he burbled. The club would be honored to have you as a guest speaker at our next meeting. Edward high-fived the gelatinous appendage proffered to him. I'm so there, bro. Gonna blow their minds. Across campus, Professor Zekton seethed in front of his hollow console, hatred etching deeper into the cracks of his stony face with every clip of Edward's stream. The arrogant man-ape's ghastly display was an affront to everything the Federation stood for. Unity, harmony, civilized order. Zekton snorted derisively as Edward boasted of humans dominating their world through brutality and weaponized intellect. This vaunted apex predator was no better than the rapacious Arcsur, yet he had the audacity to revel in his species' cruel supremacy. The Riemann professor tabbed through archived Earth history files, his eyes feasting on the violence splayed across the screen. Wars, genocides, subjugation, torturous experiments, callous destruction of their own biosphere. Humans had fashioned an entire legacy from their barbaric impulses. Zekton smiled coldly as he spliced together the most egregious atrocities into a damning montage. This video would be the instrument of humanity's downfall. Once the Galactic Alliance saw mankind's true face, they would have no choice but to shun Earth from their enlightened ranks. Professor Vortis paced anxiously in front of the holographic star map, his head-tails lashing. "Edward," he said gravely, "I implore you to reconsider this course of action. You are making dangerous enemies." Edward rolled his eyes. "Come on, Prof. You're overreacting. So I ruffled a few feathers. So what? The people deserve to know the truth about where I come from." "You don't understand," Vortis pressed. "Zekton is not to be trifled with. He has toppled entire civilizations for far less than your perceived transgressions." "Good thing I'm not a civilization then," Edward scoffed. "What's that crusty fossil gonna do? Bore me to death with one of his lectures?" Vortis sighed wearily, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I cannot force you to heed my warning. But I implore you, Edward, tread carefully. You are playing with fire." Edward clapped the despondent Riemann on the back. "Relax, Prof. I know what I'm doing. Trust me, this Xenobiology Club presentation is going to be one for the history books." Meanwhile, in the fetid underbelly of the extranet, a meticulously edited clip reel of human barbarism pinged across encrypted Raymond channels. The damning images spread like wildfire, cities obliterated by atomic fire, soldiers gunning down screaming civilians, snarling attack dogs ripping into helpless prisoners. Zekton smiled wolfishly as fabricated reports of unprovoked human aggression saturated the Alliance newsfeed. The seeds of discord had been planted. Soon, outrage would blossom into righteous fury as the galaxy rallied to cast out the bloodthirsty primates before their taint could infect civilized space. And unwitting little Edward would be the spark to ignite the powder keg. Zekton almost pitied the fool. He had no idea he was engineering his own species' expulsion from the stars. But the hardest lessons were often learned through painful example. The Riemann professor leaned back in his chair, interlacing his gnarled fingers. Everything was falling into place. The barbarians would be driven back to their mudball, the Federation would be purged of their toxic influence, and Rima would stand triumphant as the uncontested beacon of galactic order. It was only a matter of time now. Edward paced back and forth in his dorm room, reviewing his presentation notes one last time. He grinned, scrolling through the video clips he'd compiled. This was going to blow their minds. The Xenobiology Club auditorium buzzed with anticipation as students filed in. Xyloth's tentacles quivered with excitement as he stepped up to the podium. "Fellow Xenophiles, prepare yourselves for a journey into the heart of Earth's deadliest wonders. I give you Edward Warren." Edward strode on stage to scattered applause. He tapped the holoprojector and the lights dimmed. "Let's kick things off with a crowd favorite, the polar bear." The audience gasped as high-definition footage filled the screen. A massive white bear lunged from an ice floe, dragging a thrashing seal into frigid waters. Blood stained the pristine snow as the bear tore into its prey. "Fun fact," Edward narrated, "polar bears can smell seals through 3 feet of ice and snow. Pretty neat, huh?" He clicked to the next clip. "Now, who's ready for some insects?" The projection shifted to show a close-up of a tarantula hawk wasp injecting its eggs into a paralyzed spider. Edward described in graphic detail how the larvae would devour the spider from the inside out. Uneasy murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several students looked ill. In the front row, Professor Zekton furiously scribbled notes, his stony face twisted with disgust. Edward pressed on, reveling in the shock value. "Let's move on to diseases, shall we? Who here has heard of Ebola?" For 2 grueling hours, Edward bombarded the audience with Earth's most horrific natural phenomena. He delved into gory specifics of flesh-eating bacteria and brain-eating amoebas. A sickening splash echoed through the auditorium as a Floraxian student lost their lunch. The acrid stench only added to the nauseating atmosphere. "And for our grand finale," Edward announced, "the rabbit hemorrhagic disease virus. This nasty bugger liquefies internal organs into a bloody slurry. Pretty metal, right?" As Edward wrapped up his presentation, shell-shocked students fled the auditorium. Some wept quietly, while others looked ready to be sick. "Hold up, folks," Edward called out. "Anyone want to stick around for some bonus footage? Only 50 credits a pop." A small group of morbidly curious students gathered around Edward. As they huddled to watch more grotesque Earth footage, Zekton slipped out, a cold smile on his face. Days later, Dean Zorgax's scaly brow furrowed as he reviewed Zekton's meticulously compiled dossier. The dean's nostrils flared with disgust. This is an outrage, Zorgax sputtered. Such depravity cannot be tolerated on our campus. Zekton nodded gravely. I concur, Dean. Swift action must be taken. Zorgax tapped his communicator. Send for Edward Warren immediately. We have much to discuss. Discuss. Edward's gut churned as he stepped into the dean's office. The room bristled with tension. Dean Zorgax sat behind his desk, flanked by Professor Zekton and a cadre of stern-faced faculty members. Their eyes bored into Edward as he took a seat. Zorgax's voice cut through the silence. Mr. Warren, we've called you here to address a grave matter. Zekton tapped a datapad, and the room filled with screams. Footage from Edward's Xenobiology Club presentation flickered to life on the wall. A polar bear tore into a seal, blood staining pristine snow. The scene shifted to writhing maggots, devouring rotting flesh. This depraved imagery has no place in our halls of learning, Zekton spat. You've traumatized scores of students. Edward leaned forward. I was just showing them the truth about Earth. Our planet's harsh. That's reality. Reality! A Floraxian professor's tendrils quivered with disgust. You subjected those poor children to nightmares. Voices rose as faculty members hurled accusations. Edward's protests were drowned out by their outrage. Zekton's eyes glittered with triumph. I move for immediate expulsion. This human clearly violated our conduct policies and endangered students' psychological well-being. Wait! Professor Vortis stepped forward, his usually placid features etched with concern. While Edward's methods were unorthodox, I don't believe he intended harm. Perhaps a less severe punishment. Less severe? Zekton scoffed. After the damage he's caused? The room erupted into heated debate. Vortis advocated for suspension or probation, while Zekton demanded Edward's removal. Other faculty members chimed in, some backing Zekton's hardline stance, others urging moderation. Edward slumped in his chair as the argument raged around him. His fate hung in the balance, bandied about by alien minds that couldn't grasp the brutal realities that had forged humanity. Finally, Dean Zorgax raised a hand for silence. We've reached a decision. Mr. Warren, you are hereby suspended for the remainder of the term. Edward exhaled in relief, but Zorgax wasn't finished. Furthermore, you will undergo mandatory psychological evaluation to determine your fitness as a student. This is non-negotiable. Rage bubbled in Edward's chest, but he bit back a retort. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, he had no choice but to nod stiffly. In the weeks that followed, Edward found himself poked, prodded, and dissected by a parade of alien psychologists. They peered into his mind, probing his motivations and thought patterns. Tell me about your childhood on Earth, a spindly Aquilin therapist prompted. Edward recounted boyhood adventures, close calls with venomous snakes, the thrill of outrunning a flash flood. The Aquilin's eyes widened with each tale. And this was normal for human children? It asked, voice quavering. Edward shrugged. Pretty standard stuff where I'm from. The reactions were always the same. Shock, horror, revulsion. Edward's matter-of-fact descriptions of Earth's dangers left his evaluators deeply unsettled. Subject displays alarming lack of empathy, one report read. Casual discussion of extreme violence suggests sociopathic tendencies incompatible with civilized society. Only Krivak, a grizzled war counselor handpicked by Vortis, seemed to grasp Edward's perspective. In their sessions, the veteran's eyes gleamed with understanding. You're not broken, son, Krivak rumbled. You're adapted. That mindset kept your species alive against impossible odds. It's a strength, not a flaw. Edward clung to those words as his suspension dragged on. The Xenobiology department remained bitterly divided. Zekton marshaled his allies, pushing for permanent expulsion. Vortis lobbied for leniency, arguing that humanity's unique challenges demanded understanding. Through it all, Edward remained defiant. He'd opened his classmates' eyes to harsh truths their sheltered lives had never prepared them for. If that was a crime, so be it. Then came the leak. Unedited footage of Zekton's carefully curated human atrocity videos spread across campus like wildfire. The deceptive editing was clear, context stripped away, peaceful scenes bookending clips of violence to paint a damning picture. Whispers of professional misconduct swirled. Suddenly, the administration's unwavering stance began to waver. As allegations mounted against Zekton, Edward's case took on new complexity. The path forward was murky, fraught with political landmines. In his dormitory, Edward scrolled through panicked messages from his few remaining allies. The tide was shifting, but would it be enough? His future at the academy hung by a thread, and the final verdict was still to come. The data breach hit the academy like a shockwave. Unedited footage of Zekton's human atrocity videos spread across campus networks, revealing the professor's deceptive editing tactics. Students and faculty alike pored over the raw footage, their shock turning to outrage as they realized how thoroughly they'd been manipulated. In the wake of this revelation, the administration found itself caught between a rock and a hard place. Dean Zorgax's office became a revolving door of heated arguments and frantic damage control meetings. "This changes nothing," Zekton insisted, pounding his fist on Zorgax's desk. "Warren's actions were inexcusable, regardless of my methods." But the tide was turning. Professor Vortis, once a voice of caution, now emerged as Edward's staunchest defender. He strode into Zorgax's office, datapad in hand, ready to make his case. "Dean, I implore you to reconsider," Vortis said, his head-tails twitching with agitation. Edward's presentation was crude, yes, but it was never meant to exploit or traumatize. He sought only to share the brutal truths that shaped his species. Zorgax leaned back in his chair, mandibles clicking thoughtfully. "And what of the psychological impact on our students?" Vortis tapped his datapad, bringing up Krevak's evaluation. "Our war counselor's assessment is clear. Edward's apparent desensitization to violence isn't sociopathy. It's an adaptive trait, a necessary survival mechanism for a species born on a death world." As the debate raged on, tensions on campus reached a boiling point. The Xenobiology Club, once a bastion of interspecies understanding, devolved into a battleground of ideologies. "Humans are a plague," a Floraxian student shouted, tendrils flailing. "They'll corrupt our society with their barbarism." "You're buying into Zekton's lies," a Terran exchange student fired back. "We're not monsters, we're survivors." The shouting match quickly escalated, and campus security had to be called in to break up the melee. Edward kept his head down, trying to weather the storm. But fate had other plans. Late one night, as he left the xenobiology lab, a group of masked figures emerged from the shadows. "There's the human filth," a voice snarled. Edward barely had time to react before the first blow struck. He crumpled to the ground as fists and feet rained down upon him. Through the haze of pain, he heard their hateful words. "Go back to your mudball, ape. We don't want your kind here." By the time campus security arrived, Edward lay unconscious in a pool of his own blood. The attackers had fled, leaving behind only their victim, and a palpable sense of shame hanging over the academy. In the hospital, Edward drifted in and out of consciousness. The steady beep of alien medical equipment punctuated the hushed voices of doctors discussing his condition. Broken bones, internal bleeding. The brutality of the attack was evident in every bruise and laceration. As news of the hate crime spread, Dean Zorgax knew he could no longer postpone a final decision. He called an emergency hearing, determined to put an end to the turmoil before it tore the academy apart. The hearing room crackled with tension. On one side sat Vortis and Krevak, faces grim but resolute. Opposite them, Zekton glowered, datapad clutched in his clawed hand. Vortis spoke first, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Colleagues, We stand at a crossroads. Will we embrace understanding or succumb to fear and prejudice? Edward Warren came to us seeking knowledge, and in return we've subjected him to suspicion, ostracism, and violence. Krivak nodded, adding his gravelly voice to Vortis's impassioned plea. I've evaluated the boy extensively. His mindset isn't a defect. It's the product of evolution on a world we can scarcely imagine. To punish him for that is not justice, it's cruelty. Zekton scoffed, rising to his feet. Pretty words, but they change nothing. Warren's actions traumatized countless students. And now? He activated his datapad, projecting footage of Edward's battered form being loaded into an ambulance. His very presence incites violence. He must be removed for the safety of all. Dean Zorgax listened silently, his expression unreadable. When at last he spoke, his voice was heavy with the weight of his decision. Edward Warren's conduct was inappropriate, that much is clear. However, the evidence suggests his intent was never malicious. Moreover, he has made sincere efforts toward rehabilitation. Zekton started to protest, but Zorgax held up a hand for silence. Nevertheless, I cannot ignore the volatile situation Mr. Warren's presence has created on our campus. Reinstatement would only further inflame tensions and potentially lead to more violence. Zorgax paused, his gaze sweeping the room. Therefore, I rule that Edward Warren's suspension will be upheld. However, he will be permitted to continue his studies at the Omega-9 Research Outpost. A murmur ran through the assembled faculty. Omega-9 was a remote facility, far from the core worlds, a scientifically significant posting, but one that amounted to exile. This decision is final, Zorgax said firmly. Mr. Warren will depart tomorrow night. I suggest you all use the intervening time to reflect on how we, as an institution, can do better. In his hospital room, Edward received the news with a mix of relief and bitter resignation. He was given one night to gather his belongings once released from medical care. As Edward packed, a familiar figure appeared in his doorway. Professor Vortis entered, his usual confident stride replaced by a weary shuffle. Edward, I've come to offer my resignation, Vortis said, his voice thick with emotion. What they've done to you is unconscionable. I cannot in good conscience remain at an institution that would... No. Edward's voice was firm, despite his injuries. You can't quit, Prof. They need you here. Someone has to keep fighting the good fight, show them we're not the monsters they think we are. Vortis's head-tails drooped, but he nodded slowly. You're right, of course. I wish I could have done more. The next evening, Edward boarded the transport shuttle bound for Omega-9. As the ship lifted off, he pressed his face to the viewport, watching the glittering lights of the academy grow smaller and dimmer. He thought of all he'd endured, the suspicion, the fear, the violence, all because he dared to show his classmates the harsh realities that had forged humanity's strength. As the last pinprick of light faded from view, Edward felt a familiar stubbornness rising within him. This wasn't the end. Somehow, some way, he'd find a way to bridge the gap between his people and the wider galaxy.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.